Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Breya, Etherium Shaper. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, but that price doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Breya, Etherium Shaper, is a 4-color 4/4 legendary human that also happens to be an artifact, costing a white, a blue, a black, and a red mana to cast, and makes 2 1/1 blue Thopter creature tokens when she enters the battlefield. Additionally, you can pay 2 mana and sack 2 artifacts with Breya to choose one of 3 effects, dealing 3 damage to a target player or planeswalker, giving a target creature -4/-4 for the turn, or yourself gaining 5 life. Which frankly gives a decent amount of targeted interaction, being able to burn players and planeswalkers, and having creature interaction that can get around indestructibility through giving 0 toughness. Now, between having access to every color but green, and having a handful of abilities you could focus on, you could build Breya in a bunch of totally different ways. But for the deck I'm going over today, I decided to focus on Breya's Enter the Battlefield effect in particular to build an army of Thopters which we can use to swing, block, or to sack with Breya for interaction. To achieve this, we're going to make extensive use of flicker effects to let us exile Breya and return it to the battlefield either immediately or shortly after being exiled. This will let us grow our board, while also providing us the means to get Breya out of some sticky situations if we leave a flicker instant in hand in case someone tries to target remover. And since we plan on having access to a bunch of flicker effects, we can also make use of other creatures with useful Enter the Battlefield effects to really bolster what we can do. And since we'll be aiming to consistently have creatures and artifacts entering the battlefield, we'll spice this deck with some permanents that burn each of our opponents when one of those 2 card types enters the battlefield under our control. But that's enough meandering, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up we have Wayfarer's Bauble, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, which can certainly help with early game color fixing. Then Felwar Stone should be able to tap for at least a few of our colors in a typical commander game. And Ornithopter of Paradise, Arcane Signet, and Decanter of Endless Water will tap for any color of mana we could need at the time, with the Decanter also giving you no max hand size. And while color fixing is important in this deck, especially early on, we will need access to some colorless mana in this deck. So for this, we have Talisman of Hierarchy, Conviction, Indulgence, Creativity, Dominance, and Progress. And finally, since we plan on making a bunch of Thopter artifact creature tokens, Inspiring Statuary will let us use those artifacts to help us cast our non-artifact spells, as it gives those spells Improvise, letting artifacts be tapped to pay for 1 generic mana. But now let's go through the plethora of flicker spells we have in this deck. I'll start with our instant spells with Cloud Shift, Momentary Blink, and Ephemerate, each exiling and immediately returning the target creature you control to the battlefield, with Momentary Blink having flashback to cast it again from the graveyard, and Ephemerate with Rebound, letting you cast it for a second time without paying its mana cost at the beginning of your next upkeep. Then Ghostly Flicker lets you exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and/or lands, which you immediately return under your control. Disorder in the Court is an X cost spell, having you exile X target creatures and investigate X times to make clue tokens, which we can later sack for some draw, and you return those creatures to the battlefield at the beginning of your next end step. And Lae'zel's Acrobatics exiles all non-token creatures you control and then has you roll a d20. As no matter the result, you'll return those creatures under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, but if you rolled a 10 or higher, before you do that, you'll return them immediately to the battlefield and then exile them again, which they will then return at the beginning of the next end step. Then Semester's End and Eerie Interlude exile any number of creatures you control, returning them under their owner's control at the start of the next end step, with Semester's End returning them with an additional +1/+1 counter. And another round is an X cost spell, exiling any number of your target creatures, returning them immediately to the battlefield, but doing this exile return process X more times after. Then Felidar Guardian exiles another permanent you control when it enters the battlefield, having you return said permanent immediately to the battlefield. And Yorion, Sky Noodle, has you exile any number of your non-land permanents when it enters the battlefield, which you return to the battlefield at the beginning of your next end step. So Yorion can also be good to blink with our single target fast blink spells, so you can then blink most of your board with it. Then Soul Herder lets you exile another target creature at the beginning of your end step, which gets returned immediately, while Soul Herder grows with a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature is exiled from the battlefield. Nahiri's Resolve gives your creatures +1 power and haste, while letting you exile any number of your non-token artifacts and/or creatures, which return at the beginning of your next upkeep. And OG, the Exquisite Blade, lets you exile and return a target creature you control whenever you cast your second spell during a turn. Miss Meadow Vanisher lets you exile a non-land, non-token permanent whenever it becomes tapped, which gets returned at the beginning of the next end step. And Brago, King Eternal, is a flyer that lets you exile any number of your non-land permanents, which get immediately returned to the battlefield when Brago deals combat damage to a player. Then Flicker Form, Abuelo, Ancestral Echo, and Eldrazi Displacer can each have mana paid into them to exile creatures you control. Flicker Form being an aura that exiles the enchanted creature and auras attached to it, returning that creature at the beginning of the next end step, and returning the auras as well attached to said creature. And it's good to note that Eldrazi Displacer's activated ability is a case where we actually require that colorless mana. And finally for this section, the Eternal Wanderer is a planeswalker that can only be attacked by one creature each combat, so relatively easy to defend as planeswalkers go. And importantly for this deck, she has a +1 ability to exile a target artifact or creature and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of that player's next end step. So consistent flicker if we want it on our own stuff, or a way to get rid of an opponent's creature for some time. Now let's quickly go over the spells that will damage our opponents while we make our Thopters. First up, Impact Tremors, Molten Gatekeeper, and Witty Roastmaster will deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. Then Corpse Knight does something similar but in Orzhov colors, having each opponent lose 1 life when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. And then Ingenious Artillerist and Reckless Fireweaver deal damage to each opponent when artifacts enter the battlefield under your control. And now I'd like to go over a smattering of other cards that will ramp up this deck quite a bit. Panharmonicon makes it so triggered abilities of permanents that you control that trigger from an artifact or a creature entering the battlefield will trigger twice. So at a bare minimum, you'd make 4 Thopters every time Breya enters the battlefield. Kardur, the Doom Scourge, can be a pain for our opponents if we keep blinking them, since when Kardur enters the battlefield, your opponent's creatures must attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than us if able, until our next turn. And then if an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and we gain 1 life. And of course we could also blink Kardur as well to get this ETB multiple times. And just in case Breya is dealt with a few too many times and gotten expensive to cast, we have a couple kind of alternate commanders with Whirler-Rogue and PN Kiran Nalaar at least making more Thopter tokens, as each make 2 1/1 colorless Thopter tokens when they enter the battlefield. Whirler-Rogue also making a creature unblockable for the turn if you tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. And finally for this section, Mechanized Production gives us an alternate win con, as you enchant an artifact you control, make a copy of that artifact at the beginning of your upkeep, and then you win the game if you control 8 or more artifacts with the same name when this is checked at the beginning of your upkeep, of which we'll be making a bunch of Thopter artifact tokens, which should meet that requirement. But now, let's go over the spells that we can use to keep ourselves from top decking. Now many of these spells are going to be creatures that have us draw when they enter the battlefield, such that we can blink them to get more draw. This will include Spirited Companion, Baleful Strix, and Wall of Omens, simply having you draw 1 when they enter the battlefield. Serum Visionary, having you draw 1, then scry 2 when it enters the battlefield. Aether Channeler, which lets you choose among 3 options when it enters the battlefield, either drawing a card, or you can make a 1/1 bird token with flying, or bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. And then Muldrifter and Thought Monitor have you draw 2 cards when they enter the battlefield. Rumor Gatherer has you scry when another creature enters the battlefield under your control, though if it was the second time that ability triggered that turn, you draw instead, and then you scry any other time thereafter. And Mentor of the Meek lets you pay 1 generic to draw whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, which would include the Thopters we plan on making. Candlekeep Sage is a background enchantment that makes it so you draw a card whenever your commander enters or leaves the battlefield, so you'd be drawing twice if you blink Breya. And Thopter Spy Network has you draw a card whenever 1 or more of your artifact creatures deals combat damage to a player, while making a 1/1 colorless Thopter token at the beginning of your upkeep. And finally, Tamio's Logbook can be tapped with up to 1 blue and 5 generic mana to draw, but that cost drops by 1 generic for each other artifact you control. So we'll rarely be paying full cost, and for the most part, just be paying 1 blue mana to draw. Now Breya can provide us with a decent amount of interaction, provided we have the mana and artifacts to fuel her, and we have plenty of blink spells that we could use to protect Breya in many instances, so I have less interaction spells than my typical commander deck here, but regardless, let's go over our dedicated interaction spells. To start, we have Counterspell and Stoic Rebuttal as general counterspells, and Negate to counter non-creature spells. And then Swords to Plowshares and Dispatch give us the ability to exile a troublesome creature, either keeping it from resurrecting if it wasn't a commander, or if there was something that's so tanky Breya might struggle to deal with it. Then we have Ravenous Chupacabra, destroying a target creature, and Massacre Worm, giving our opponent's creatures -2/-2 until the end of the turn when they enter the battlefield. with Massacre Worm also having opponents lose 2 life when one of their creatures die. And as these are creatures, we can also flicker them to get these ETB effects again. And then for some board wipes, I'm sticking in white with Organic Extinction and Austere Command. The former destroying all non-artifact creatures and also having Improvise, so we can use our Thopter artifacts to help pay off that mana cost. And the latter letting us choose 2 between destroying all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's go over that land base. Starting with some land tutor lands, we have Shire Terrace and Promising Vein, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Myriad Landscape, which can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. And we also have the cycle of Modern Horizon 3's 3-color land tutor lands with the appropriate colors for this deck, with Contaminated Landscape, Perilous Landscape, Seething Landscape, and Shattered Landscape, each of which can produce generic and can be sacked with no additional cost to tutor 1 basic land of 3 basic land types onto the battlefield tapped. And then we have a handful of Triumph tap lands with Mystic Monastery, Crumbling Necropolis, Arcane Sanctum, and Nomad Outpost. And then Exotic Orchard should tap for at least a few of our colors in your average Commander game, while Spire of Industry, Path of Ancestry, Public Thoroughfare, and Command Tower will tap for any color of mana that we need, though Spire of Industry costs 1 life to access that mana and requires us to control an artifact, and Public Thoroughfare needs you to tap a land or an artifact when it enters the battlefield or we sack it. And then Bonder's Enclave gives us a bit more access to draw on a land, requiring us to control a creature with power 4 or greater, which thankfully Breya meets. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 5 plains, 5 islands, 4 mountains, and 4 swamps. And now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently sitting right around $44 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but doesn't include costs such as shipping. Now before I close out this video, I'd like to quickly go over a few upgrades you may wish to consider when building or adapting this deck. Essence Flux is a mana efficient fast flicker spell if you're wanting to shave down your mana curve a bit more. Venser, the Sojourner, has a +2 ability to slow flicker one of your creatures, and also has a pretty useful interaction ult if you can get to it, where you get an emblem that has you exile a target permanent whenever you cast a spell. And since we'll be aiming to have a wide board of Thopters, you'll likely stand a decent chance to protect Venser by the time you get him out. Displacer Kitten has you fast flicker up to 1 target non-land permanent you control whenever you cast a non-creature spell. And then Satoru, the Infiltrator, has you draw a card whenever 1 or more other non-token creatures enter the battlefield under your control without being cast or having mana spent to cast them, which would include every time we flicker a creature. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you like the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe consider subbing if you'd like more budget Commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.